On the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month in 1918, the guns fell silent. The First World War had come to an end with the defeat of Germany and its allies. Yet, in the spring of 1918, victory for Germany had been tantalisingly close. Here, on Mount Kemmel, in the French-Belgian border, the Germans achieved a breakthrough, capturing the strategic hill. After a short, one-hour barrage involving artillery and poison gas, shock troops came in and in bitter fighting took this hill from the French defenders. In 3 offensives in the spring of 1918, it seemed that Germany was going to carry the day. But they were stopped short of Paris, and the overwhelming numbers of the Allied forces, reinforced by the Americans coming in from across the Atlantic, with overwhelming superiority in artillery, tanks and aircraft, began to tell, and the Germans were pushed back. The British pierced the key Hindenburg line, and the German army began to fall further and further back. At home, with starvation affecting the civilian population, revolution began to sweep the streets of Germany. The German emperor abdicated and fled to Holland, and the new German government and the German High Command understood they had to ask for peace. In a railway clearing to the south in Compiègne, the Germans turned up to sign an armistice under terms which they came as a shock to them. The war was over. For many, this was the war to end all wars. But was that the case?
We asked Neil Faulkner, editor of Military History Monthly, and Nigel Jones, author of Peace and War, Britain in 1914, to discuss how the war ended and the fallout from it. In addition, we asked 2 other experts, Alex Nieves of Cambridge University, author of Capital, State and War, and military historian Gordon Corrigan, who's written extensively on the subject, for their comments. How did World War I end?
Well, of course we know that the Allied powers won, but we have to take it in the context of the November Revolution in Russia in 1917. We have to take it in the context of the Kiel Mutiny in Germany. I mean, the German power wasn't so much militarily defeated as politically exhausted. Now, that doesn't mean buying into some sort of stab-in-the-back myth that is often propagated within German conservative circles, that the socialists and liberals rose up and that they, made the power, German power, kind of discontinue the war. But they were certainly politically exhausted. And of course, the other powers, the Central Powers, were already knocked out, really, of the war by that time.
And is it the case that a major mutiny broke the back of the German military?
We have to take in the political context when discussing the end of the war, absolutely. And there was also a fear among the British and Allied policymakers that if the war continued much longer, that there was going to be revolution elsewhere.
Gordon, should the Allies have agreed to the armistice?
I think there's no question that militarily that was the right answer, and certainly Haig and Pershing wanted to push on into Germany, and Haig said exactly that. If we stop now, a myth will arise that they weren't defeated. Now, the reason that didn't happen was that Clemenceau, the French Prime Minister, he wanted peace at any price. He wanted peace. France, remember, had a far worse time of it than we had. There was far more French blood shed in the First World War than British blood. France had 7 million less population than Britain, twice as many military deaths. They wanted to stop. So they weren't prepared to go on for another 6 months or so. And Britain, as the junior partner, had to go along with that. It would also actually have been very difficult to convince Lloyd George, who never really believed in the Western Front anyway, that we should crack on for another 6 months. So military, yes, the right answer. Politically, not acceptable. And as you rightly say, of course, that was part of the myth that did grow up. That and the Versailles settlement provide all the reasons for extreme nationalism and really lead to the rise of the Nazi Party.
We've talked about the end of the First World War. An armistice was signed. You've argued actually probably the Allies should have gone further than that. They accepted an armistice. This was the war to end all wars. It didn't quite end up like that. Yeah. And many people actually see the Second World War, with all the differences, being a continuation of the First World War.
I would broadly accept that argument. I think that's absolutely right. I think Germany was left with grievances, however misplaced those grievances were. Because the Allied armies hadn't got onto German soil, they were allowed to propagate what was called the Dolchstoßlegende, which means the stab in the back legend, i.e. that Germany had not been defeated in the field, but had been betrayed by shirkers, strikers and Jews and communists at home. a legend which the Nazis propagated most assiduously. And there's a remarkable difference, in my view, between the attitude of the Allied countries after the war and the attitude of Germany, and indeed Italy, which was more or less a defeated country, although it had been on the winning side. It hadn't got much out of the war. There was resentment. There was, whereas on the Allied side, there was the idea, oh, we must never ever do this again. This was dreadful. This was disastrous. In Germany, it was a smouldering resentment. We didn't win, we were cheated of victory, we will have our revenge. So I think in that sense, and as it was exploited by the Nazis, World War II was a continuation of unfinished business of World War I.
And it certainly wasn't the war to end all wars, was it, unfortunately?
No, and that of course is famously what John Maynard Keynes said in a very famous paper, the great economist of the Great Depression as he becomes. He says that what is being done to Germany is creating the basis for a new conflict. And you see, I think what I would say is that the First World War was an imperialist war between rapacious imperial powers, and the victors, of course, used their victory to enrich themselves at the expense of Germany. So there are these absolutely colossal reparations payments, for example, that are imposed upon Germany that cripple the German economy. So they create the conditions of national dismemberment, the loss of territory, and the financial prostration that brings Germany to the depths in the Great Depression when the Wall Street crash happens. And Nigel was absolutely right. This contributes to the ability of the Nazis to build a mass movement, which is essentially a nationalist movement. It's a movement which is built around the idea we're going to restore German power. So I think it does make sense to talk about the whole period from 1914 to 1945 as part of a single conflict, primarily between Britain as an imperial power on one side and Germany on the other, though in the case of the Second World War, one that morphs into a new conflict, that between the United States and the Soviet Union.
The Versailles Treaty of 1919 was hailed as peace in our time. But Alex, it began to unravel very quickly.
Yeah, they unraveled very quickly. I mean, the Versailles system that was, conceived of by Wilson, Lloyd George, they didn't last for very long whatsoever. Of course, there's a large debate as to was the Versailles Treaty actually that harsh, or was it more Wilsonian, or was it a kind of a very harsh peace but dressed in Wilsonian garment? I don't think it was actually an overly harsh peace. Depending on how you see it, of course, without even going into kind of war guilt debates or anything like that. But it wasn't as severe as the German policymakers made it out to be. I think there was a little bit of rhetoric going on, obfuscation there. But it didn't hold very long whatsoever. Of course, shortly after the Versailles Treaty was formed, the U.S. Senate voted out of going to they wouldn't ratify the treaty going into the League of Nations. So the U.S. and that was Wilson's creature, the League of Nations, and the U.S. didn't even join.
The liberal order in Europe did not long survive the war, did it?
No, it pretty much disintegrated thereafter. Of course, we had the Weimar Republic, and we had that working up until about the Weimar Republic, that is in Germany, working up until 1930, and then being replaced by kind of monarchical dictatorships, and then leading to the Nazi seizure of power in 1933. In Italy, of course, we had fascism in power quite early after the end of the First World War, and elsewhere also in Hungary, you had a pseudo kind of fascist regime there, and elsewhere,
Some people have said there was a 30-year long civil war in Europe as a consequence of 1914. Do you think that's a description of really what happened?
No, because Europe then, as now, was still separate nations. Despite the best efforts of the European Union, Europe has never been and is not now a united continent. So I don't accept this civil war narrative at all. It was competing nationalisms, competing power blocks. I think that's the narrative that the EU would like us to commemorate it. But as an ardent opponent of the European Union, I don't accept that at all, and I don't think that should be the way that we commemorate the war.
A European civil war?
Well, and I agree with what Nigel has just said. My problem with the EU narrative is that what the EU is about doing is creating a capitalist bloc that can compete with other capitalist blocs in the modern world, and now you need a much bigger bloc in order to be able to compete in world market terms. Whereas at the time of the First World War, and to a degree the Second World War, you could have a Europe of nation states with each national economy big enough, in a sense, to be an adequate sized market to support the big corporations. So we've shifted in terms of scale when you look at the development of the system globally.
I think it's a very strong case for it. I think if the Weimar Republic had survived, you would probably still have had the Second World War, but the lineup might have been different. We might have gone to war against Russia because Russia was the bugbear. That's what everybody was afraid of. But the restrictions of Versailles, and this was the French, the British didn't. The British said, well, we've got to bring Germany back into the family of nations. We don't want to be too hard on it. That wasn't acceptable to the French. Now, of course, we'd never been invaded by the Germans. Every generation, the Germans marched into France. So the French had suffered considerably, and I suppose you can understand why they wanted buffer zones and reparations and all the rest of it. But I think there's no question that Versailles very much contributed to extreme nationalism and the Second World War. And if that had not been the case, Weimar might have survived. Germany might well have developed into a modern democracy.
Well, yeah, I think actually, I mean, I don't know if the first person did that, but Lenin actually said that this is the beginning of a European civil war. And yeah, I do see there being a civil war emerging with the origins of the First World War and lasting all the way to the Second World War. I mean, you have the ideological bifurcation of Europe during the interwar year period, with the communist states, of course, emerging, and then fascist and Nazi powers emerging as well. So this was not simply a military contest, but a political and ideological battle as well.
Alex, did World War I lead to World War II?
That's a very interesting question, a very complicated question, of course. As far as the conflicts that led up to the First World War and then that were unresolved after the kind of failed peace treaty of 1919, I certainly think that it was a continuation, the same sorts of conflicts. I mean, particularly, I mean, if you're looking at a kind of German-centric view, the German kind of drive for a continental economic empire. I mean, that certainly shows a lot of continuities from the foreign policy making before the First World War into the foreign policy making of the Nazi regime. Of course, the Nazi regime had a very different angle on it. That was this fantastically racialized ideology. But as far as the kind of basic material, economic, and political aims, I mean, there was a lot of continuity there. And of course, there's a lot of continuity as far as the kind of overarching crisis that was engulfing both the kind of capitalist empires and also capitalist modernity as a whole, and the kind of geopolitical and social consequences of this kind of the industrialization process that had occurred over the long 19th century, that I see as kind of building up the systemic pressures for the First World War and then leading to the Second World War.
Whilst we were filming outside Ypres in Belgium at the Yorkshire Trench, we met some members of the City and County of Bristol Army Cadet Force who were on a tour of the World War I battlefields. We spoke to Joe, Rory and Morgan about what their thoughts were after visiting the trenches and war cemeteries of northern France and Belgium.
To show my respects of World War I and all the soldiers that fought 100 years ago, and I feel very privileged to be here today.
And you're looking here at the trenches, what do you think it would be like to have served here?
I feel horrified because it's very closed in, but the soldiers who must have fought here were, you know, magnificent. It's like incredible.
It's marking the 100th anniversary for World War I, and you know, people have laid down their lives for our freedom, sort of thing. So you know, it's only right that we come pay our respects and learn about what's happened and the horrors that they may have faced.
And this morning you met some German soldiers who were tending a graveyard at Landmark, didn't you?
Yeah, absolutely. It was very interesting to speak to them and their opinions. You know, that they were cleaning and re-chalking the gravestones there, and it was great to hear their opinions of it. And they were absolutely privileged to be able to do that. It was a voluntary service, and they are all active soldiers. So.
And looking at these trenches, can you imagine? I mean, it's a sunny day today, but can you imagine the rain and the wind and even the winter serving here?
Absolutely, it really must be horrific. You know, it's really close, horrible, and you know, with mud up to your knees in some places, you know, must have just been horrible. Really must have.
I think that the more people that come here and see it before anything else happens to it is the most important thing, because I mean, they're not going to last long, I don't think, so most people need to come and see it before anything happens to it, to remember what's happened in the past.
And looking at these trenches, I mean, these are reconstructions, it's a sunny day, but could you imagine serving here in the winter, in the rain, in the mud?
I think it would actually be horrific. I would hate it, I actually feel sorry for the soldiers and all the people that had to do it. They're very brave. I would never have done it myself, but I guess it's just something they have to do.
This morning you met some German soldiers who were tending the graves at Rheinmark Cemetery. I mean, how did you get on with them?
We asked different questions about them, as we didn't understand what they said on the graves. We asked, and most of them on the graves said unknown, so they didn't really know who the soldiers were. I mean, it was absolutely horrific. I mean, different soldiers were just buried in the same places as others. I mean, it can go up to 12 soldiers in one place, and I just thought it was awful.
Finally, we asked Neil Faulkner and Nigel Jones how, in the centenary year of the outbreak of the Great War, we should commemorate it.
Well, I do know that the British government is completely incoherent and doesn't know how it's going to commemorate this because, as usual with this flabby government, it's trying to be all things to all men and please all parties. They are on the one hand saying, yes, this was a big heroic national victory, but we mustn't be too nasty to the Germans and mention the war at all when we're commemorating the war because that might offend them. And Germany is now the leading paymaster of the European Union and at all costs mustn't be offended. So they're falling between those two stools and they're completely incoherent. They don't know what the hell they're going to do about the First World War. I think it should be commemorated. It was a horrendous tragedy, first and foremost. But many millions of people in this country, in our country, were affected. In fact, the entire nation was affected. Most people have family stories to tell. Most people will want to commemorate ancestors who fell or were involved in their own way. So I think there should be broad national ceremonies of remembrance and commemoration, quite solemn. But I hope that it will stimulate people to find out about their own family story. I hope that as a historian. And also to say, well, we should never let such a horrendous tragedy happen again. Although, as a pessimist, I rather fear that we always will let such tragedies happen again.
And Neil, how would you like to see it commemorated?
Well, I agree with some of that, but I think I put the emphasis very much on the stories of ordinary people, not just participating in the conflict and being impacted upon it as victims in one way or another, but also on the role of ordinary people in resisting it. So I want to hear the stories about the conscientious objectors, the pacifists, the anti-war activists. I want to hear the stories about the mutinies and the strikes. I want to hear the stories from the perspective of the Indian nationalist and the Irish nationalist and the African nationalist. I want to hear the story about one of the 100,000 African porters, for example, worked to death in a white man's war to decide whether German imperialists or British imperialists would rule East Africa. Those stories from below need to be told, and we need to learn the lessons from that experience, that this was a world gone mad, a dysfunctional world, and a world that we need to ensure we never see again. And that's all about building peace and solidarity and understanding between people.
Well, that's a pious hope, but I don't think the world today is any better or any safer than the world was in 1914. And I'm afraid I take a much more pessimistic view than Neil. I think we're going to go on struggling and fighting till the end of time.
I began this series at my granduncle's grave in Belgium. If he'd survived the First World War, he would have returned to Britain to be told by its leaders that he'd fought and won the war to end wars. But that was not the case. Not for any of the generations born since the guns fell silent in November 1918. War has become a permanent feature of our lives. Perhaps, in this centenary year, we should be asking the question why that is.